It gives me great pleasure to introduce Maddi Holmes, who will be giving us Herp of the Week this week. And it's a big surprise as to what the actual Herp of the Week is. Over to you, Maddi.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be presenting Herp of the Week this week because this is my favorite animal in the world. I was first introduced to this animal when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and every single thing I learned about it made me love it more. These quotes about it that are kind of meant to be reminiscent of kind of like a movie poster review are quotes from actual scientists and experts who've worked with this animal, and it has been described as extremely rotund and having the laziest hunting mechanism ever. It is none other than Notaden bennetti, the Crucifix Frog. Like I said, I was first introduced to this animal in undergrad when I was studying a unit called Australian Vertebrates, and we had to do a presentation on an animal that had an impressive adaptation or set of adaptations that allowed it to live in an extreme Australian environment. And we were allocated our taxonomic group and our environment, and I was allocated amphibians and the desert. And this didn't make a lot of sense to me as a young budding zoologist because amphibians have to stay wet and the desert is not wet. So this sent me down quite an interesting rabbit hole about Australian desert frogs, and this frog is absolutely my favorite frog. It is a member of the family Limnodinastidae, or the ground-dwelling frogs. It is part of the genus Notaden, and they're known as the spade-footed frogs. And due to their warty skin and somewhat grumpy appearance, they are often incorrectly referred to as toads, but they are not part of the genus Bufo and they are not toads. They're considered to be a medium-sized frog, though I would say they're a very diversely sized frog because they range from very, very small to up to the size of a tennis ball. So they come in a lot of sizes. And despite not being toads, they do actually share a lot of characteristics with toads, including they have short and stubby legs. They're not very good at jumping. They don't have much webbing in their toes, and they do look kind of grumpy. They're named for their characteristic cross pattern on their back, which is red and black, and then set on top of their bright yellow skin. And they're mainly feed on termites and ants, although they can adapt their diet if they need to, but we'll get into how they forage a little bit later. Depending on who you ask, the family Limnodinastidae, the ground-dwelling frogs, is either a subfamily of Myobatrachidae, the ground frogs, or it's its own family, but either way, it's a frog that lives on or in the ground. Great. So it is found in black soil plains, floodplains, clay pans, and the semi-arid grasslands of New South Wales and southwestern Queensland. Although, if you look at the latest range mapping from the Australian Museum, there are confirmed sightings in parts of South Australia, as well as one from Alice Springs. So really, it just seems that they range where they can. They're one of the very few Australian frog species that actually displays aposematism, which is the use of bright colouring to ward off predators. Typically, it's associated with being toxic or poisonous or venomous, but Notaden bennetti is none of those things. It is completely bluffing, and it's hoping to convince you that it's definitely poisonous when it isn't. And it seems that is working really, really well for them because there is no known predator of this frog. There might be some opportunistic predators, but there is no animal we know of that preferences eating this frog. So it seems to be doing really well in its bluffing. So much so that it wasn't actually until about 1995 when researchers analysed the mucus secretions of the frog that we realised ourselves that it's not toxic. It was assumed to be toxic until then. So they spend most of their life underground, surfacing only when rainfall is adequate. And they live in areas that undergo extreme changes from arid to essentially wetlands and marshlands, but only temporarily. After a heavy rainfall, for example, in the Macquarie Marshes in New South Wales, it can go from looking like a desert to a completely lush wetland in just 2 years in those photos. And due to the irregularity of the rainfall, they can't occupy permanent bodies of water because there are no permanent bodies of water in their habitat. And so they have to figure out a way to not die when it's not wet. And unlike other desert living frogs in Australia, such as the water holding frog, which will build a cocoon around themselves to keep all their water in with their own skin, the Notaden genus doesn't do that. And we're not completely sure how they're able to survive for so long underground, because they can go for months to maybe even years without resurfacing. But there are some adaptations that definitely are helping them along. Firstly, they don't burrow in super dry soil. They just won't do it. And it seems to be that they preference only burrowing when they feel a certain level of moisture in the soil. Secondly, they reduce their activity enormously once they're burrowing. They burrow very lazily, and once they finish burrowing, they pretty much do nothing except very mildly breathe until they are ready to resurface. Thirdly, they burrow really, really deep. So water holding frogs, for example, are typically found in the first 20 centimeters of soil, whereas a Notaden frog can be found up to 3 meters down in the soil, which is incredible. And then lastly, they also aggregate in their burrows, which is a bit odd for some burrowing frogs. It does happen, but it's not hugely common. And we think that that might be a mechanism to increase the overall humidity that they have in their burrow and reduce any evaporative water loss. So it's pretty incredible how they're able to be a frog that doesn't live in any permanent water system. Once those rains come though, and they seep through the ground and they wake this frog up, it wastes absolutely no time getting to the point of why it's alive, which is of course to reproduce. Ooh. So the life cycle of the crucifix frog is relatively short, but extremely efficient. Pretty much as soon as they are on the surface, they are getting to work. That said, they're getting to work in their special own little lazy way. It becomes a mating frenzy. However, the males are not really all that interested in putting a lot of effort into finding their females. Instead, what they'll do is they'll find themselves a nice temporary pond that they think is pretty good. You know, it's got a lot of mosquito larvae, it's got good reeds to make a little nest around their egg patch. Everything's set up for them, and they will plonk themselves down in the middle of the pond and float spread-eagled and scream and just wait for the ladies to roll on in. Which is just such a fantastic way of handling how intense this mating frenzy is, because there are so many frogs around. Why would you need to put any effort into finding your own mate? Just let her come to you. After laying eggs, tadpoles hatch usually within a couple weeks and metamorphose into fully grown frogs within 6 weeks typically. We're actually very lucky that Melbourne Zoo successfully bred this frog for the first time ever in captivity earlier this year, and we now know a lot more about how this reproductive cycle works. And it's not as consistent as it used to be assumed, that there would be a very consistent timeline for each clutch of eggs. It's not the case. It really depends on the individual egg, how quickly that tadpole will hatch and how quickly it will metamorphose, which is pretty interesting, especially considering that's in a very controlled captive environment. The way they got them to breed in captivity, which they had been trying to do for a very, very long time, a number of years, is quite brilliant as well. The keeper, Raylene Hobbs, who is a reptile and amphibian keeper at the zoo, found a YouTube video titled something along the lines of 10-hour epic thunderstorm. and put it on an iPad, put the iPad in a sink near the frog tank and let it play all night. And when they came back, there were egg patches for the first time ever in captivity. And it turns out thunderstorms really get this frog in the mood. So when provoked, all members of the Notaden genus will secrete this sticky glue-like substance, which is aptly named frog glue. The glue produced by bennetti is particularly interesting, as unlike other members of the genus, it is completely non-toxic. It's highly elastic, it's porous, and it remains functional, as in it maintains its adhesive properties and its elasticity whilst wet, which is essentially unheard of for most adhesives. This has led to it being investigated in medical research because it has a really high level of biocompatibility, and it is 5 times stronger than any currently used medical glue, which is incredible. Current research, when I first made this presentation, was still trying to figure out how to synthesize it in a lab. And I believe from the very brief Google search I did on this frog to prepare for this presentation, I think they have either successfully synthesized it now or they're really, really close to it. And there's research into using it to repair torn cartilage, which is pretty interesting. I've chosen this photo specifically to show the frog glue, partly because the frog is very round here and I love that, but also because you can see the glue secretions on its head and its back, and you can see that they're sort of milky white and orange. It originally comes out white from their skin, and then as it hardens or sets, it turns more orange. Beyond the medical applications, this glue obviously needs to have a purpose. Why do the frogs secrete it? We're not 100% sure. There is a theory that it's to ward off predators, because perhaps they'll eat the frog and get a mouthful of glue and not know what to do and just spit it out and not have a good time. That's possible. Another theory is that it's to do with how they hunt. And I'm not really sure we can call this a hunting method so much as a foraging technique. Notaden bennetti, like its mating system, prefers to not really do anything and would rather plonk itself down and wait. But how do you do that when you are having a mating frenzy and you need to eat an enormous amount? Simple answer is you make glue and you sit on an anthill. Notaden bennetti will find itself a prized anthill, will plonk itself down on top, start secreting its glue, and then ants will stick to him or her, and that's how they'll catch their food. The glue will clog up the mouth parts of the ants and termites so they can't bite, and it's essentially just layering up on ants. But then how does he eat the ants? They are now stuck to his body. What should he do? Well, he's thought about that. He's got a plan. He will just slough his skin off and eat it all at once. His skin, the glue, the ants, a little package. Very efficient, very interesting. But of course, not every frog is going to find a prized anthill. Some are going to be smaller and be bullied off the prized anthill. And what are they to do? They still need ants. That is where they will implement the best hunting technique I have ever seen in my life, which is known as pedal luring. They will gently wiggle a toe and attract insects to their gently wiggling toe. That's it. They won't go any harder than that. They don't want to. And I'm not sure if I can share the video of it, but there is a video of it at that link where you can see just how gentle the toe wiggling is and how little effort it is. But it does work incredibly well. It does draw the attention of insects, and they do catch insects by doing pedal luring. It's pretty impressive. Their current status is least concern. They're a very abundant frog, although because of their reliance on these temporary floodplains and temporary pools, drought is a huge issue for them. We don't know exactly how long they can stay underground, but there's a good chance that 15 years is not the answer, and a long-term drought has the potential to wipe this frog out pretty rapidly. as well as that prolonged destruction of habitat that changes the water table could influence their ability to resurface and breed. And potentially competition with cane toads, tadpoles might hinder their fast growth rate, rendering them unable to metamorphose before the pools dry up. And we do see that in the field, a number of pools with half metamorphosed frogs that are dead because they've dried up. And yeah, that's Notaden bennetti. It's my favorite frog ever, and I love it.
Wow, that's a lot of frogs. Fantastic.
He's a bucket of frogs.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. I've got one or two. Has there been much sort of field work on these guys? I'm just wondering about the foraging tactic and the cost of producing that glue. I mean, how often can you actually use that method? Is anything known about that?
I'm not 100% sure. There's not a huge amount of fieldwork done on this frog anymore. There was back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, but most of the research on this frog now is to do with using it in medicine. But because they're eating their own glue after they've secreted it, they don't overall lose too much in terms of resources. And I think they get more out of it than they lose because it comes back in full of ants.
Yeah, in my experience, I think it is at least partially used for defensive mechanisms because all Notadens do this excretion, and they're the only Australian frogs that exude this glue. But they all tend to do it when you handle them, sort of aggressively. So that suggests to me there's probably a defensive element to it.
And how sort of uncomfortable or toxic is it for humans?
It doesn't taste very nice. It is extremely sticky.
So sticky.
Crazy. Like you will totally get your fingers stuck together. It's actually quite difficult to get apart or to pull something off it. At least some of the species.
Does it do anything to your mucous membranes? Because I've had frogs, where your eyes just start watering, and it's quite how volatile are those secretions?
I've worked long enough on frogs that I've learned not to touch my eyes and other.
Oh, this was just in a car. We weren't even.
Really?
Yeah, that's
wow.
Scaphiophus.
Oh, Scaphiophus.
Yeah.
Some of the heliopores can make you pretty crook if you're not careful and get any of the soft tissues. I've handled lots of Notadens and I've never had those sorts of problems. But again, I'm kind of pretty careful to touch their eyes.
Most of the field work on Notadens is on Notaden nicholsea, which is the spade-footed burrowing frog. Ooh, is that what it is? Something like that. And I think it's mildly toxic, it's glue. I believe Notaden bennetti is the only Notaden that's not toxic whatsoever to people, which is why it's so special in making medical adhesives.
Maddi, I have a question about toxicity, because I think about this a lot, because people always talk about animals being venomous or poisonous or toxic. I find it tends to do with just whether or not that relates to humans.
Yeah.
Most people agree that funnel-web spiders are we call them super venomous, but if they bite a dog, I'm pretty sure they won't even kill a dog. And you have to think in terms of evolutionary terms, we're probably not the target of funnel-web venom, right? We're probably not a major predator on funnel webs, and we're certainly not prey. So it seems like it's maybe a bit of an evolutionary lucky dip or unlucky dip, that's the case, something like that. So in terms of because I actually don't know a lot about what people have done in terms of researching how toxic these glues are, but we say they're not toxic. Does that just mean they're not toxic to humans?
Yeah.
Or have people gone out and really carefully thought about what's preying on this frog and tested and looked at toxic compounds that might actually affect other animals that aren't, or even mammals?
I don't think anyone has, but we also don't know what preys on this frog. There's literally no information anywhere that anyone's got any ideas if anything eats the frog in the first place. That could be because it's super toxic to something that might have tried to eat it once, but yeah, I don't think anyone's looked into it beyond toxicity to humans.
Yeah, because it's a really important question, right? What is it evolutionary past that might have been significant predators of frog explosions in the desert? And is it toxic, something out there, or was it toxic at some point so that perhaps it wasn't always a mimic, or maybe still isn't?
Yeah. Well, other members are toxic to us and presumably potentially other mammals, and aren't brightly coloured. So that's a bit strange. But yeah, it'd be interesting to find out.
I guess another question is, if it is a mimic and it's not apoptotic or toxic itself, what is it mimicking? What would predators learn that's brightly coloured out there?
It's a very uniquely coloured frog. I'm not sure if in any field guide you read that talks about how to identify this frog, they all make a strong point that there is no frog that inhabits the same range as this one that looks anything like it. Like, you will not have a hard time identifying this frog, which is really strange.
I was quite surprised by the distribution range you showed when you said that they've also been found in South Australia and
Alice Springs.
And Alice Springs. I mean,
Yeah.
that's quite far from that known distribution.
Yeah, they're not considered, those sightings are not considered part of the official distribution because there's a non-zero chance it was human translocation, especially Alice Springs.
I'm not sure if there's a good field guide we could consult.
I think the last one wasn't.
They're still waiting for
I think any field guide where it's sold would actually have the range map touching on South Australia.
Yeah,
Although
definitely.
the Northern Territory must be.
Oz Museum's got a fantastic map of where it's been.
Simon, is there a link where people could buy that particular field guide that you were just holding up?
I think
or provide a review.
Any decent online book seller or Amazon or any good store
would have
the link.
Is there a way to get a signed copy?
I dare say if you contact the author,
Something could be
he or
arranged.
she would be more than happy.
Do we have any other questions? I have one last quick question. I mean, I didn't realize that there were pedal lures.
It's so wonderful.
Yeah, that's something that's in the ceratophrys in America and a whole bunch of frogs. It would be kind of cool to
see if I can.
for somebody like Simon Backins to do a big comparative study and try and figure out the evolution of pedal luring.
Wonderful.
It's not a sponge.
Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of competing hypotheses there.
Like the efficiency of counting. That was downloading captive frogs.
I mean, I remember seeing this in African toads as well.
I believe there's also some salamanders that do it.
Yeah.
It looks very similar to cane toads doing it.
Yeah.
It's so silly. It's so cute. I love it.
It's wide open for some pretty cool studies, I reckon. Sounds to me like no one's really even tackled the right cover.
Yeah.
Or, being apoptotic or anything like that particularly well.
I agree with that. I think I was digging through the literature recently, because I was speaking to Raylene, the keeper who bred these frogs, and she mentioned to me the cocoon thing, because it was on some news articles and the Wikipedia, which I have now fixed, saying that they create a cocoon, and they absolutely don't. And it's not in any of the literature. So I was digging through literature to find out where that idea came from. And I found a paper from 1971 that gave me the answer. But pretty much there hasn't been research on its life history or just ecology or anything like that since about 1998.
That's amazing.
Everything's been on medical since then. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that are unanswered about it still.
Where are the the sort of healthy local populations? The
Everywhere.
Quarry Marshes and
That's probably the place you want to go.
I believe Sturt National Park has them as well after rain.
But wherever they occur, they're so abundant that it wouldn't actually be a difficult species to work on. You just need to be ready to go with the rain to. I mean, the other interesting thing about the Notaden is none of the species overlap in range by a long way. So they're all really unique, really allopatric. So something interesting is going on in these guys. But yeah, wherever they occur, they're super common. I'm surprised people don't
this could be a good lab project.
Yeah. And only one of the species is not colourful.
Wow. Fantastic.
They look like ping pong balls, and that's the best part.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Maddi. That is a very cool frog.